Good morning, all. Myself Chandra, and today we are going to discuss about the basics of SQL, as well as we are going to discuss about database connector and how we can consume the data from the database and how we can provide it as a service from the Mulesoft. So first of all, we need to know the data. So data is nothing but information. So it can be anything like example, it can be a person information or location information. Location means address information, or well as it is an object information. For example, if there is a item, so it will have some properties, kind of what kind of item and what is the code for the item. So those kind of details will come under object information. So these kind of details that we wanted to store somewhere, right? So the types of data are varied based on the information that we are going to gather and store. For example, the types of data in general are structured data and unstructured data. So relational data, so structured data, it is in the form of relational data. So that means there will be a relation between the objects or the tables that are defined within the structured data. And it also contains the predefined structure. That means before we create the tables, we have to make sure that what kind of data that we are going to store, and accordingly we need to define the column names within the table, so that we will call it as predefined structure. And the data that we are going to store within these tables or objects or types, it will be in the form of rows and columns. For example, if we want to store person information, we need to create that person table with so and so column names. That means person name as well as person Aadhaar number. So these kind of information we need to define it as columns, and we can store multiple persons information in the table. So that is the reason we have multiple rows. So each row will represent a record information of the particular person. And we call these structured data databases as RDBMS. So that means it is the relational database management systems. And some examples of RDBMS are Oracle database and MySql database, as well as Microsoft SQL, as well as DB2. And the other types of data is unstructured data. So there will be no relation between the tables or objects within this database. And the type of structure that we are going to define within the unstructured data will be dynamic, so that if we are storing 4 fields or 4 columns of data within the unstructured table, and tomorrow we might need to store additional attributes information or additional columns information, we can still store that information without altering or modifying the structure of the table or object. And it is mainly based on the columns information. So column based rather the rows based information, we can access and store the data using unstructured data formats. And also that data that we are going to represent within this structure is key value pairs. And the examples of this database, we call it as NO-SQL databases. So NO-SQL means it is not only SQL, along with SQL, we can store the structures like directly JSON format structure or XML format structure, and also some text data. All this kind of information we can directly store by using the NoSQL databases. And some of the examples are MongoDB, as well as Redis database and Cassandra database for the unstructured or NoSQL databases. And let us understand why we need to store the data and where we have to store the information. So why means in today's world, everything is digitalized. That means whatever the information that we wanted to gather. So we are storing those information as a digital data. And that digital data, earlier days, it was in the form of files or books. We used to enter the data manually in the books. So instead of writing the data into files or books physically, now we are going to store that information in some machines or data centers. That is why we are calling it as digital data. And to store the information in machines or systems, we need some sort of databases that can understand and also fulfill the needs of an organization. Here, organization means whoever is going to perform the collection of data or whoever is doing that business. We call them as organization or company. And based on the needs of that organization, they can choose which database is suitable for their business or for their operations, and accordingly they can store the information. And the benefits of storing the data in the machines or databases will be like, so once we have the data, we can analyze the data and perform and forecasting, as well as we can produce the reports. We can do some enhancement to the business where we are having a gap between the customers and our business operations. So these kind of analysis can be done by using the data. So I have listed some of the examples here. I can discuss one or two. So first thing is that there is a supplier. So the organization is manufacturing the products and they are supplying the products to customers. So in this event, they have to get the information like how many orders they have received per day and how many orders they are able to deliver to the customers. So to gather this information, first they need to store the information in systems. Then only they can perform the operations or analysis on the records. And next example is like, so there is a company and that company wanted to understand how much expenses they have uh, occurred. Occurred means they are in a month. So those kind of information can be performed by using the data that is stored in a data centers or databases. And we have another examples listed down here. So today we are going to mainly focus on the RDBMS databases. Basically in RDBMS, the data that we have to store is in the form of tables. Tables are objects. So first of all, we have to define the database. In which database we need to store that or create the objects. So first thing that we need is we need to create a database. And within the database, it can have multiple objects information. So to store that information, we need to create tables. And the table will have columns with a structure. So what kind of data it can be stored. So here, whenever we are mentioning it is a table and having columns. So the data that is going to be stored will be in the form of columns. For example, if there are two columns and there will be number of rows based on the information that we are going to store. For example, we want to store one object information. So we can provide that information in row 1 in the columns 1 and 2. And then if there is object 2 information, then we can store that in row 2 or record 2 and storing the values again in the same columns, column 1 and 2. So in this way, we can create the records. So that means we are going to perform the CRUD operations on the database tables. I mean to say CRUD operations is like create, read, update, and delete. So here while creating the tables and storing the data, we have to follow few normalization rules. That means whenever we are storing the data, there should not be any duplicate data, and also we should not repeat the data across the tables or databases. Like if we want to store some information, it can be divided into multiple tables instead of storing the information or all the information in one table. So in this way, we can organize the tables and organize the relation between the tables. So here create means whatever the table that we have created, we are going to store the information. To store the information, we need to use the insert operation or insert record, and that we call it as a create. And once the data or record is created, to get the data or to select the data, we need to perform some operation or queries. So that we are going to refer it as select query, select records or select query operation. So for this, we will have the syntax like select and then star from table name and then where clause. So here, whenever I am mentioning the star means it is going to return all the columns of this particular table, and we can define the table name in the from class. So in from class, we have to define what table name it has to refer. And also we can mention the where class. So if we do not mention any where class, then it is going to return all the records that are available within that particular table. And if this where class is like going to act as a filter condition to represent or to filter only certain records and return that particular data. So these kind of information we can build by using the select query. So this will be our syntax. So where class, we need to provide column name, and then condition. So if this column name is equal to so and so value, then we can provide that result, value 1. And sometimes there might be a need like we need to update the details of a particular record. So in that case, we have to use the modify operation or update operation so that we can update the fields or columns in a particular table, or even we can update the particular record information. So the syntax will be like update set. So in set, we have to provide the column names and value, and we can mention where class. Conditions. So we can apply multiple conditions. Here also you can provide based on the column name and value. So for example, you want to update the column 2 information, column name 2 and value is 2, and you want to update this information only for the record 1. So there will be a column 1 value so and so, and then based on that you have to update the column 2 information. If we are not going to provide this where class, then this column 2 value will be updated for all the records in the table name, in the particular table. So we need to be careful when we are performing these update operations. And there is one more operation that we can perform on the database records. So delete. So if there is a need, like we have records are stored from the last 6 months, but we want to delete the old records that are more than 3 months old. In that case, we can perform that operation by using delete commands. So for example, the delete command syntax will be like delete from table name, and you can mention filter condition to which rows it has to be deleted. So column name and value, so that it is going to match this column name of the record, and it is going to delete only that particular records from the table. If we do not provide this operation, then it is going to delete all the records from this table. So in this way, we can perform the CRUD operations. And below are the some examples. For example, in MySQL or Oracle, the syntaxes will be almost similar. And when it compares to the Microsoft SQL or DB2, the syntaxes will be uh, slightly varied. So once we learn one of the SQL language, so SQL means, let us try to understand what is SQL. SQL means structured query language. So we are going to write a syntax in the SQL to perform these CRUD operations, and we can achieve the business requirement. And here we see few of the syntaxes we can perform in the database. For example, there is a database, we have connected to the database. So once we are connected to the database, we need to know what are the databases that are available within that particular connection. So you can use this operation. Likewise, you can use a use command to use particular databases that are available within the connection. And once you are providing the database name, then you can come to know what are the tables that are available within that particular schema or particular database by using the show tables commands. And one example we can use, there is a select operation. So select operation is used to retrieve or get the details from the existing tables. So this is one of the examples, like we need to select all the columns information from table MySQL.user table. And here we are not providing any where condition. So it is going to return all the users information with all the columns. Likewise, we can choose the operations or syntaxes. And here I am going to specify few more conditions. There might be a need, like we wanted to check for null values. Null value means there is no data or values that are inserted or updated in the particular column. So in that case, we will call it as null data or blank data. And to compare that value or to check that values, whether the column is having a value or it is a null data, we have few syntaxes. For example, select is null. Let us verify this condition in the MySQL. So we are verifying that instead of null, provide a name. It is MySQL. So MySQL is having a value, and we are verifying with is null function. Yeah. So there is a value, but it is returning 0. That means whenever it is going to return 0, that means it is a false, and returns 0 if there is value. And returns 1 if there is no value, which means null value. Yeah, if we observe here, we are not providing any value, and this execution of the statement is given 1. So that means whenever there is a null value, each null function is going to return 1. That means it is matching the condition. So in this way, we can perform each null operation to know whether that particular column data is empty or the value is available. And sometimes there might be a need to check the value, and if the value is null, we want to return some default value. In that case, you can use this function if null function. If null function, so it is going to accept 2 parameters. In first parameter, if first parameter value is null, then it is going to return the second parameter value. So this second parameter value, we will call it as the default value. And we will have stored procedures also. So stored procedures means stored procedure is a programming language in the SQL or databases. It is so we can write the stored procedures to achieve a task by writing sequence of statements in that particular stored procedure. So for this, we will call it as Oracle PL-SQL. So programmable language of SQL, PL-SQL. So we will discuss about the database connector now. And database connector is used to connect with any databases like Oracle, MySql, or DB2 of the servers that are provided. And to fetch the information or to perform some activity on the database, we can use the database connector within the Mulesoft. So in this scenario and examples, we are going to use the MySQL database, and we have seen how to install the MySQL database, and also we have seen a sample test connectivity, how we can perform that within the our system setup session. So let us see a few details like in order to connect with a database, we need to know the host name. So this will be host and port and also username and password. This is a database, and also we need password. This information is needed to connect with any database. And also in order to connect from Mulesoft, we need drivers to be installed in our project. And our today's use cases are like below. First, we need to get the supplier's information by using a SQL query or select query, and we are going to represent that data in JSON format. And we are also going to get the supplier details by using a stored procedure instead of select query. And in stored procedures, we have different types, like we can provide the input parameters and output parameters. So we are going to see both the scenarios. And in order to proceed and get that information from the database, first of all, we need to create the records or create the database and create the tables. So So we are going to create the database in the MySQL of local instance. For that, go to MySQL workbench and connect to the local instance. So here, go to the connection details and you can verify by providing all the details. Here you can provide localhost or the IP backtrace address and the port name, username and the password details. Then click on test connection. Once the connection is successful, then you can close and go to database. Click on connect to database. The connection is successful and we are now connected to the database. So here, in order to check whether the server and service is up or running, click on this instance and you can see it is running. And even though whenever we are trying to connect or test the connection, if the service or server is not running, then we are not able to proceed further. It will throw an error. I'm closing the tab. Now, in order to open this SQL tab, we have to click on the new SQL tab here. So click on this tab and we are going to check what are the databases and what are the schemas available. Use command show databases. So whenever we use this command, it is going to list all the databases of the local instance. So use this command to list down all the databases that are available within the MySQL local instance. So these are defaultly provided databases: information schema, MySQL, and performance schema, schema whenever we install the MySQL in our local instance. And in order to create a new database within the local instance, we can use command create database. So create database and DB name. With this name, we are going to create a new database name. For example, I want to create HBT new. Click on create. To execute this command, select the command and then click on this power symbol or execute. Whenever we create or execute this command, it is going to show some response that we can observe in the lower section. Now select the first query and execute it. So whenever we execute it, now we can observe that there is a new database that is created in the instance. So in this way, we can use the command to create a database. So for now, I'm not going to use this newly created database. I'm going to use the HBT database. So for that, use the command name is use, and then we have to provide the database name, use HBT, and execute the command. So whatever the activities that we are going to perform now, it is going to be performed within the HBT database. Now we want to create a table first. So to create a table, we have syntax. Let me add the syntax here. Create table and syntax name is like table name. And after that, we have to provide the column names here. Column 1 and data type. Here we need to provide the data type. And if it is a number or integer, or if it is a varchar and string data, so those kind of information we need to provide in the data types. If we want to create a few more columns, then we need to provide additional information with column 2, and then again we have to provide the data type. So in this way we can create a table. And if we want to increment the value by default whenever there is a new record is created in the table, then you can use auto increment so that it can accept the default value every time and it is going to add a value based on the previous record. But to add a auto increment default value, we need to mention this data type as integer. Then only it can accept and create the table. And different data types are integer, varchar, and also we have date formats. And there are other formats like blob. Blob means it is a binary large object data and character large object data. So it is for huge payloads and some image files and this kind of information we can store. And we are going to mainly concentrate on these three data types. And there is one more variable like Boolean data type. So we can store the information whether the information kind of true or false. And we have one more thing like constraints. So constraints are like whenever we are creating the table, so we can add the constraints like what kind of information the particular column can store. So what kind of information we can store in a column. So this is going to be applied on the particular column information. So we need to, so we have to define this whenever we are going to create the table or alter the table information. But once we have the data inserted in the particular table, and if we want to apply some constraints, then it is going to create a problem. Like it has to verify the existing data, and then it can create the or apply that particular constraints. So in order to define the constraints, we need to make sure that we are going to design our table first, and then we need to keep in mind what kind of exact data that we are going to store in that table and columns. So some examples are primary key. So primary key is like we cannot store null values and duplicate values. Whenever we define the column as primary key, then we cannot store the null values or duplicate values in that particular column. And there is one more, not null. So if the column is applied with the not null constraint, then we cannot store null values. One more, we have unique constraints. So whenever we define or apply the unique constraint on the column, then we cannot store duplicate values in that particular column. So likewise, we can define the constraints. There is one more default constraint, like if value is not provided, then default value will be stored. I am saving all this information in our notes, and I can share this via email because I am unable to upload all the content in the YouTube description. It is limited to certain amount of data only. So I cannot provide all the details within the description. Please mail me whoever needs these notes. And now we will use the syntax to create the table. Here we are going to create the table with suppliers table name, and it is going to have the column names like supplier number, supplier name, address, zip, and created by creation date, last updated by last updation date. These columns we also call it as a who columns. That means who have created the record and when it is created and when it is updated and who updated this record information. It is going to be useful like to track the changes. And we have the supplier number. It is going to store the information up to 30 characters. If we are going to provide the supplier number with more than 30 characters, then it is going to throw an exception. And this supplier number column is going to check for the null values and also duplicate values before inserting the data, because we have provided a primary key constraint. And for supplier name also, we don't want to store the duplicate information. So then we can refer the unique constraint as well. So we are going to apply two constraints, not null constraint as well as unique constraint. And we cannot apply the primary key on multiple columns for each individual column at a time. So, but we can apply this composite primary key to act on both the supplier number and supplier name. And in this example, we are not concentrating on that. So let us try to execute this table syntax. Now the table is created. Once the table is created, we want to store the information, or we can apply or perform the select operation if there is any data available or not. So to use that, use a select query, select, and to return all the columns from the table, use a star, and from we need to provide the table name. Table name is like hbt.suppliers, and then execute the command. So whenever we are performing this or executing this select statement or select query, so we call this as a select query or select statement, and it is returning the table structure, but within this table structure we do not see any data, so it is returning a zero column, sorry, zero rows. And we can even create these tables by using a graphical user interface also. I'm going to just show that. So from the tables, so for that, go to schemas on the left pane, and then from there, select your schema or database, and then from the database, select the tables and right click on it, click create table. So here we can provide the table name, and we have to add the column names and also what kind of data it can store. And if we want to provide a default value, we can use, and we can use the primary key, not null or unique constraints. This kind of information we can provide. I'm closing this. Now we have a select statement, but it is not returning any data. We will try to insert or create a record, sample record in this suppliers table. So from the MySQL workbench only. So one more note here, date format should be like this, like year, month, and date whenever we are storing that information. Insert syntax is like insert into table name, and then we have to provide the column names, column 1, column 2, and we have to provide the values, value 1, value 2. This way we can store the or insert the record in the particular table. So I'm going to use the actual syntax, and this syntax is going to store the information in suppliers table in all these columns, like supplier number, supplier name, and created by address and zip. If we want to store additional information, we need to provide the column names. So here in the suppliers table, we want to store the information like supplier number as supplier 1. So if there are 5 columns we have provided in this syntax, then we have to provide 5 values. Now we want to store all the columns information like supplier number, supplier name, address, zip, there is created by, and also we want to store creation date. We want to store the last updated by and last updation date. Supplier number is going to be supplier 1, supplier name is human brain supply chain, address, zip, and created by, creation date, last updated by, and last updation date. And in this way, we are going to provide the information into which column, which data has to be saved. If we are not going to provide these column names, then it is going to insert the information in the sequence of the table that was created. So in the first column, the value will be supplier 1. Likewise, it is going to insert all the information. And it has to match the values with the number of columns that was created in the table. And if we are going to provide these column names manually, then we can send the information or create the information only for that particular columns. For example, if I don't want the information for the last updation date, so that I can remove that column name and I can remove the value. Or even you can apply the order in the manner that we can need it. So I want to store last updated by, but I am providing the value at the end of the syntax. So whenever we provide these column names, so order can be anything. Let me create the value. Now the record is created and there is a success response. Let us execute the select command here. If we see here, we have the value supplier 1, human brain supply chain, and all the information that was created by using the syntax or insert command. So in this way, we can perform the insert operation. So let me, so there is a need like this information, the zip value, this postal code is not correct. So we want to modify that existing data. To modify the existing data, we can use the update operation. Use update syntax, update, and which table we want to update. Update hpt.suppliers, and we need to mention the column name. Use the syntax set, column name is zip, and value is, instead of 500101, I want to store the information of 110. For which record this information is to be affected, we need to provide in where condition. So I am going to provide this information on the primary key. So we need to make sure that we are providing this where conditions on the primary key, or it is going to affect more number of rows. If you want to, and if there is a requirement to update the information based on the creation date or created by, then you can perform that activity as well. So here I am providing supplier number equal to supplier 1. So we are mentioning for the supplier one, I want to update the zip details or postal code details in the suppliers table. I am going to execute this command. The update operation is successful. Now execute the select statement. With the new results that we have, it is having a updated value of 500110 in the zip column. So in this way, we can perform the update operation. We have seen create, read, and update. Now we will perform the delete operation also. For example, this supplier one is not needed and we don't want to store that particular record information. In that case, we need to delete the record or remove the record. So to delete the record, we have a syntax like delete from table name hvt.suppliers, and we have to mention where condition, like which record we want to delete. Supplier number. So here we can mention the value, which record we want to delete. Select this statement and execute it. So delete operation is also successful. Now try to run the select statement. If we observe, we do not have any records from the select statement that is executed. In this way, we can perform the CRUD operations in the database. Now we are going to perform these operations from Mulesoft services, because we are not going to connect to the database and we are not going to perform these operations whenever there is a need for the business. So what business is going to do? They are going to log into some dashboard on the front end application and they are going to perform some activity. They will send a record or they are going to send a JSON format data from the front end application. And we cannot capture that information and we cannot see and enter the data in the database. So in order to achieve this integration from front-end application to back-end database, whenever they are going to create the record or modify the details of supplier, or whenever they don't want the supplier and they want to delete that supplier. So these kind of activity they are going to perform on the front-end screens, because users are not aware of the technologies or what is happening inside the technologies and how it is performed. So all they want is some easy accessible dashboards and they can perform the activity. So in order to provide a service to perform the CRUD operations on the HPT database on the suppliers information, we are going to provide a Mulesoft service and we will provide that service to the front-end applications and they are going to consume our service in the front-end application and they will call accordingly based on the business requirements and the front-end activities. So for that, let us move into the business requirement. So we have to create the record. So our business requirement is to get the supplier details using a select query and also stored procedures. But before that, we need to insert the record. So for that, create supplier record in database using Mulesoft service. We are going to create this service first. This session is going to be prolonged because we are discussing in detail and all the operations, and so that you will be aware of what is the database and how the stored procedure can be called from the Mulesoft, and also the basics and and also the basics of database and what is SQL. All this information we are discussing. So it is going to take time. Please stay back. I am moving to Anypoint Studio. So within Anypoint Studio, in our connectors API, go to source main mule and click on and right click on it, create a new mule configuration file. In this operation, select the file name as DB operations. DB suppliers operations. Now I'm going to create a flow. We want to expose this service as a REST service. So we need to use listener and the path name is DB suppliers. So we are going to receive a supplier information, and that supplier information we want to create. Okay. And add a database connector. So in database, to add the database module, click on the add modules in the mule palette and search for database, drag and drop into the palette. So here, whenever we are going to add this, it is going to add a Maven dependency into the project. Let us check that. If you see here, once we added this, it is adding a new dependency in the form.xml. Now we want to perform a insert operation. So use insert. So there is a bulk insert as well. Bulk insert is useful to perform a bulk records of insertion at a time. That means to insert more than one record or multiples of records, we need bulk insert. So bulk itself will represent more than one or multiples of records. So we are going to create a new connector configuration. And in this connector configuration, mention it MySql HPT MySql database config, and the connection should be MySql connection. Here it is giving a warning, please add the required driver. This is what we mean by we have to add the drivers whenever we are going to consume the services in Mulesoft. So these drivers are dependent of the connection. So if we are going to create a Oracle connection, we have to install or load the drivers that are related with Oracle drivers. For now, I'm going to add the recommended libraries for MySql. And we have to provide the connection details of database. So our connection details are like host name is localhost and port is running on 3306, username and password. And also we can provide the database name here. If we do not provide the database name, it will try to connect to a default database. So click on test connection. Now the test connection is successful. Click on OK. Save the changes. And here we have SQL query text for the insert operation. So we are going to mention insert supplier. And here we have to provide the SQL syntax. So we have a SQL syntax already. We are going to copy paste it here. So this SQL syntax, we can directly give the insert statement. And also, if we want to dynamically provide these values, so we need to make sure that we are going to provide this information as a parameters, input parameters to this query. So that can be done by using the input parameters. But to add input parameters, we need to make sure that we are providing the values as a binding parameters. Use a colon and then provide the value as supplier number. So this supplier number we have to provide in the input parameters. Click on FX and add an object format, supplier number, and that supplier number can be the value. So in this way, we have to provide multiple input parameters if there is a need. I'm going to say this as supplier name, and the value for it, human brain supply chain. So these kind of values we are going to add one by one. And if we want to directly provide the value also, we can directly provide here. But if we want to read it from the payload and assign it to the variables using input parameters, we can do it more better way by having the values and mapping input parameters. So instead of directly giving the hard-coded values here, if we are going to provide the service, that means we need to read the values from the service that we are exposing. So we have to give the payload dot supplier name, supplier number. And this value, I want to read it from payload dot supplier name. In this way, we are going to read it from the payload. I'm going to pause the video and I will map all the values. I have added the mapping. So here we are going to provide the supplier number with the input parameter name of sub number. And that sub number we have to map in the input parameters. So here we have a sub number key, and the value for that we need to provide from the payload, input payload, and we are going to read it from the supplier number. So for this, we have to provide an input payload to this service or to this flow. And also here we need to observe that if we are not providing a parameter name here, and we can provide the direct value also within the values without using the parameter names. And one more thing, it is always suggestible that these input parameter names or key names, if we define it as same as the table column names, it is better and there will be no confusion. So it is always suggestible. And right now I'm just using the sub number instead of supply number, and I am going to rename it in the next run. Save the changes and add one transform message after the database operation. So here add a JSON, because by default the database operation is going to provide a Java result, object result in the form of Java format. So for that we are converting into JSON format. Save the changes and deploy the application. Make few more changes. Rename this to post supplier operations flow, and on the HTTP listener Display name, change it to create supplier. And in the advanced tab, add a allowed method as post. So because we want to send the information and redeploy the changes. Since we want to send the information and also the payload, and we are going to create the method as post. Application is deployed. Let us send the request from Postman. So our resource name is DB suppliers, and there is a base path API on the HTTP listener connection. And we need to use post method and body as JSON, and these are the details. So we are providing supplier number, supplier name, address, and zip. And by default, within this operation, we have another parameters also. Let us have a look at it. So along with this zip information, we have two columns like created by creation date and last updation date. So for creation date, since it is a date parameter, I am going to use now, that means today's date, and I am converting into a string format with the year, month, and date. And for created by, I want to use the default value of connectors API. And for last updated by, I am not sending the information from the input parameters. And for last updation date, I am using now without the formatting. So we are going to check how the information will be inserted into the database. And for last updated by, here we are directly providing a value. Let us send the request. We are receiving a value internal server error and column name, supplier name cannot be null. Let us check if there is any mapping issues or. So we have supplier number and supplier name, and that supplier name is going to accept the input parameter value of subname. And in the input parameters, we have subname, but let us check the value for it. We are reading the value from payload.supplier name. Okay, here there is a typo error. L was missed. So we can directly copy that from the input payload request if we see any issues. Address, and here we need to send the information in postal code instead of zip. Redeploy the application and we will test it. Test the application. If we see here, we are having some error response from the database. It is saying data truncation and incorrect date value. So for last updation date, we are not able to insert the direct value that is available in the now function. So we need to format that value. Use a format as we have done for creation date, and then click on done and redeploy the changes. And before redeploying, as we have mentioned, instead of using the input parameters name different, better to use with the same column names. Supplier name, supplier name. We are able to send the values, but just for the common practice or best practice purpose, I am using the same column names as input parameters. But these input parameters and the values that we are reading are different with the fields. So this is the request that is going to be sent by the source system. So we need to map the source system fields to the target system. application is deployed. Do one more run or test from the postman. Now we are receiving a success response and it is saying that affected rows are 1. That means with this operation, one record has been affected or created in the database. So I'm going to just run the select statement directly on the MySQL workbench. So MySQL workbench is a database connectivity tool to connect to database. And here, while after running the statement, we can see the data that was sent from the postman now is inserted as a record in the supplies table of SQL instance. In this way, we can perform the create operation or insert operation. And we can observe that the last updated by is created as MySQL because we have provided that value as a direct value in the insert statement. Here, this value. So if we want to send this value from the mapping, our input values or input request that is going to be received to the connectors API, we can map that as a parameter. So now I'm going to remove this and adding it as same parameter name. And the value will be like, I want to create this record on the name of the API, connectors API. Now we have created a record. Likewise, we can create multiple records. So I'm going to create the same request again. So let us try to send the same request and observe the result. So whenever we are sending the same supplier number details, it is saying that duplicate entry for supplier 4 for key because there is a primary key column on the suppliers table. So it cannot insert a duplicate data. Now we have inserted one supplier information. Likewise, by using this service, we can create as many records or suppliers information needed. And this service can be configured within the front-end application. All we need is this set of data or payload needs to be sent from the front-end application. Now we are going to read the data from the database and we will expose it as a service. I'm going to stop the service. Create one more flow. And operation name is DB suppliers. But the method is going to be get method. If we observe here, the path or resource name is same in both the scenarios, but the method is different. And this is why we call the services as the REST methods, because resource names are different, but it is changing the activity based on the HTTP method. Now rename the flow instead of this get DB suppliers operation flow. So rename the flow as get suppliers operations flow, and I'm going to add a database connector. And now use a select operation. So click on this database and use a select operation. Drag and drop onto the flow. Select the configuration. And after that, use the select statement in the SQL query text. So to list all the details from the table, what is the syntax? Select star from table name. So our table name is hpt.suppliers. And here we are not providing input parameters. If any input parameters are conditional based supplier information is needed, then we have to provide the input parameters. So I'm going to leave it blank and save the changes. Deploy the application. Since we were getting an exception without transform message, it was unable to render. Database operation was unable to give the response that can be understandable by the HTTP listener. So we are adding this transform message and sending the response as a JSON format now and test the flow. If we see here, we have received a array of records that are supplier information, and this supplier information is having supplier number and all the columns that are available in the database. So if we want only few columns data, then we can use the select operation with columns. So here, instead of star, we can provide the column names. Like I want supplier number and also supplier name. So this is depending on the requirement. And I want address and also zip. So if we provide these column names, then we will get only that particular columns information from the table. And also here we can provide a where condition. That means we want to filter the data based on the provided information or condition. So I want to give a condition like if zip code is matching with a certain value, then only return that particular information. So here we need to add that parameter. Parameter name is zip and we need to provide that value. So I want to send a query parameter to this service, connectors API service for get suppliers flow. And that parameter name is postal code. If this postal code is sent, then I want only that particular information. Save changes. Now send a new request for the get suppliers flow. So whenever we are sending a request and we are not adding the parameter postal code, it is not returning any response. Let us try to send the information. We know the value is 500110. Send that value. And if we observe that whenever we are sending this postal code query parameter with the value, then we are receiving that information of the particular zip matching with the supplier. And if I are going to send a different value and observe it, and whenever we are sending a different postal code that is not available within the records, we are getting a empty response or empty array of records. So in this way, we can achieve the parameter based select query. So we need to get the all suppliers information even though if we are not providing the postal code. So how can we achieve that? So I'm unchecking it and sending the information. So here instead of receiving empty array response, we need to list all the suppliers information. So go to our select configuration, and here instead of directly providing the value, use the function if null, and if that input parameter value is null, then I want to match all the values of the table. So we have to provide the column name here. Redeploy the changes. Now we will send a request. If we observe that we are getting the supplier's information that is available if we are not sending postal code. And if we send a postal code and if it is not matching the records, then we cannot get any records information. And also we have to observe that in our first select operation that we have performed, we have star in the select statement and we have received all the columns information. That means all the key values. But now we are receiving only 4 fields or 4 columns information since we have provided the column names in the select query. Here. And we can also do a perfect mapping like where the column names to be produced. So you can have that mapping as well. So I'm going to do that mapping. I want the information to be mapped side. For the transformation input, we have a payload of array. So to map these records, we have to use payload and map. And within the map, provide the name as supplier and index of supplier. So we need to map the details as per the need. So we want supplier number and supplier number should be mapped from input records of payload.supplier number. Likewise, we are going to map other details. So I want supplier name and this value needs to be mapped from supplier underscore name from the database. We have address. So address details, I want it from the address. So if we are having or defining the metadata, we can directly map the details. So and another value is postal code. Add a value from zip. Next value is created by and creation date. I want the value from supplier dot creation date. So in this way, we can map the records into the required format. So I'm going to create a new record and we will check this service. So instead of supplier 5, add the value as supply. So instead of supplier 4, add the supplier number as supplier 5 and the supplier name as hospitality services. Now we are going to create this record into a database and postal code is 502101. Once the application is deployed, send a request to create a supplier. Data too long for column. Okay. So we have a limit of 30 characters on the supplier name. So provide the value hospitality services. So instead of this, I am providing services. Send the request. See that affected rows is 1. That means the record is created successful. To test this, instead of going to MySql or database, we can test this from our service itself. So use a get supplier service and send a request. Now we can observe that we have transformed the records in a format that are needed for the other applications. Instead of having supplier underscore number as a field name or key name, in the supplier's response, we are defining the response as supplier number, which is a JSON format, and this application or service is going to be used by other applications or services. In this way, we have created a record and also getting the records from the database. Now we will define one more service to update the information or modify the information. Create a flow, and this flow modify it as update suppliers, update supplier operations. Add a HTTP listener. So for update operation, we need to use patch method and go to general, update supplier details. And in the path, so path is our resource, use update supplier. In generally, what will happen? We need to provide the information with the key. Whenever we are updating the information, we need to provide that particular record, which record has to be updated. For that, use a URI parameter. So we are going to create a patch operation on the supplier's resource, but with URI parameter. Here provide supplier number. So this will be our URI parameter. Then we are going to use the database update operation. Select the configuration and use the syntax update. Table name is hpt.suppliers and use the keyword set. And we want to update the column. Right now, we want to just update the information that is needed. For example, I want to update the information of zip. So set the information and the value is zip. And also I want to update last updation date and last updated by. Last updated by. Value is last updated by. So we are providing a parameterized query here. So last updation date also I am providing it as an input parameter. Now as string format. And the last updated by is connectors API. And this zip value, I want it to read from the payload.postal code. And for example, if we want to update other information as well, then we can update the information. So you want to update the supplier name, supplier underscore name, and read that value from payload, supplier name. So we are going to update 2 columns for that particular record. Zip supplier name will be reading from the input, and last updated by is going to be connectors API, and last updation date is the today's system date. And we have to provide a where condition, where otherwise all the records will be updated, which is not correct. We need to make sure that we are updating a particular information. And here we are not updating the entire resource. That means we are not updating the entire record information. We are updating only particular columns records, and that is why we need to use patch. Patch is going to perform the partial update wherever we need the modification or changes of the particular columns. So here columns and also the record. Use the where condition, and the where condition provide the value supplier number. Provide this in the input parameter. So this input parameter we are having it in attributes URI parameters. Parameters dot supplier number. Since our supplier number needs to be provided, we need to make sure that we can perform a check. So add a choice condition. So we are using attributes dot URI params dot supplier number multiple times. Instead of using this, we can create a variable, so which can be easily accessible. So add vars dot supplier number. So we are going to create a variable. Let us add a transform message in both the roots. Here I want to get the response as it is payload, and if the value is empty, then I want to return a message. Please provide supplier number. Save the changes. Now make use of this post suppliers information, and I'm going to create a new request. Get this information. Add a JSON request. And then here we don't need a supplier number in the input request or a payload. We want to send the information in. So I want to send hotel services. Instead of hospitality services, I want to update the information of supplier name as hotel services. And I want to use the postal code and update this information as well. Instead of 101, add 111. So I am sending this supplier name and postal code in the payload. This information needs to be updated for the supplier file. Instead of the get method, use patch method. Send a request. We are receiving an information affected rows 0. We need to check why the information is not getting updated. So we have a request update operation. Here instead of attributes array param, use the vars keyword. Vars dot supplier number. Okay. Check for the URL value. It is same. We will run the application in debug mode. Application is deployed. Let us send a request. As of now, there is no variable. And we can see variable is created with supplier file. Move further. Supplier name, postal code. And we have the information here. Let us try to execute this using a mule debugger. So the values are like supplier number, Jeep supplier name is available, and also last updated by last updation. So we are having the correct values which needs to be updated in the service. Okay. Let us check and move further. We have received a payload. It is going to be a DB statement result, and we need to convert that into a JSON format. So whenever we see that, okay, now there is a affected rows 1 and the values are updated in the service, and the values are updated in the database from the Mulesoft service. So to check these details, we can run our get supplier service. So let us see here, we have a supplier file with postal code as 502101 and supplier name is hospitality services. So now we have updated these two informations, these two fields. Send a request, and we are now getting a updated information from the service. So in this way, we can even modify or update the information, partial information. Because we are saying partial information, we are not updating all the fields or all the columns of the particular record supplier file. We are only updating the information that is received. So we are using a patch information. And if we want to replace the entire resource of the supplier file, then you can use a put operation. And also if the supplier 5 record is not available, then it is going to create a record. And that is the purpose of the put operation. So that in that way, we can differentiate resource update, entire resource update using put operation and partial update using a patch operation. Now we will implement one more service to delete the supplier record. So this service is delete supplier operations flow, add HTTP listener, and the method should be delete. Add a path or resource name as db suppliers, and here also we need to provide a URI parameter because we don't want to delete all the suppliers. We want to delete a particular supplier information. Add a variable so that can store the information of supplier number. attributes dot URI params dot supplier number, and after that choice condition, it is going to be same and similar to the update operation. Add a transform message, and also database delete operation. We will configure one by one. First, configure the choice condition. Expression not is blank. The value is vars dot supplier number. If the value is not blank, then move into this root. And here I want to perform the operation on this HPT MySQL database with the condition delete from HPT dot suppliers where supplier underscore number equal to the value. So on that value, we are going to provide an input parameters. So this value we are going to read from the service of attributes information. So that attributes information we have stored in variable. Convert the database result into a JSON format. And if there is no value, we wanted to throw a different message. Please provide supplier number. Save the changes. Debug the application. Once the application is deployed, let us send a request. Make a change to send the method as delete, and we are using API-DB suppliers resource and URI parameter. And here we don't need to send any payload. We can remove this. None. Send a request. Move step by step. So we have a variable value with supplier 5, and that value is assigned to supplier number variable. Since the value is available, means it is not blank, it is moving to the database operation. Let us check the payload. So this payload is 1, and it is having a Java result. Let us convert into JSON format. So this JSON format is returning 1. So let us check whether that operation is successful or not by running the get supplier service. If we observe here, we have received a value of 1 and the supply record is deleted from the database, and we are receiving only one supplier information when we are using a supplier service. So we can make sure that whenever the value is 1 or the result is 1, that means it is a success response from the database. So here we have to enhance the service if payload equal to 1, add a message supplier deleted successfully, and that supplier is so and so supplier. That means vars dot supplier number. Supplier number, supplier 5. Let me do one thing here instead of adding here. So we are going to return a message supplier add the supplier number is deleted successfully. In this way, we are returning a valid response to the service consumers. Else, no supplier found with supplier file and record not deleted. So we are returning a response. Let me check what is happening. If payload equal to 1, then we are returning this response. Yeah, here we have an issue. We need to add that concatenation after the variable. Okay, in the same way, whenever there is a insert operation or update operation also, we have to make sure that we are returning that required response. So here payload dot affected rows equal to 0. Supplier creation is failed. Else supplier created successfully. We will check the update operation and what kind of response we are receiving, and based on that we will update that. So for update also we are receiving the information like affected rows, and based on that we have to return the result. I'm copying from the post. So here I am mentioning if the affected rows is 0, returning a message supplier update is failed. Otherwise I am returning supplier updated successfully. So we have modified the post service response, update service response, and also delete service to return a response. Save the changes. Send a patch request to this update information. Let us go and resume the service. I am removing the breakpoints also. And here we can see that supplier update is failed because the supplier 5 is not available anymore in the database. Run the supplier get supplier service, and we can see there is no supplier 5. Let us try to create a record. Supplier 5 hospitality services, and from the post service also we are getting a supplier created successfully response message. Run the get suppliers. Now we can see 2 suppliers information. Go and update the record. So here instead of hotel services, I want hospitalities. Earlier our record was like hospitality services, but I want to update the information hospitalities. Send a request, and we can see that success response with a valid and understandable message. Supplier updated successful. Now let us try to delete a record by providing a supplier 5 information. So instead of supplier 5, let us try to send a record with supplier 6, which is not available. Send a request. And we are receiving a response with no supplier found with supplier 6 and record not deleted. That means supplier 6 record is not available in the database and operation is failed. Let us try to send the information supplier file. Send the request. Now we are receiving a success response like supplier 5 is deleted successfully. So in this way, we can achieve the CRUD operation by exposing the functionalities as microservices or REST services using Mulesoft. And in our next session, we will discuss about the stored procedure and how can we execute the stored procedure with different syntaxes and different signatures. Thank you. Please like, share, and subscribe.